Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. As you can see, people are coming from all over the country, and Olivia is actually abroad. That's why we're doing this 10 a.m. Oh, not enough coffee in the day type of thing. But we are going to power through to talk about body positivity in romance. And we have these amazing authors here, Denise Williams, Julie Murphy, Sierra Simone, Olivia Dade, and they're going to be talking about all of the important things. But before we get to them, I just want to say a couple things. One, I'd like to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. We couldn't do it without them. I would also like to thank all of our authors for allowing us to share this program with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we just make magic. And this is obviously going to be a magical program. So you can buy signed books from any of our authors from Aesop's Fable. I'll drop a link in the chat, and I will also send it out in a recap email so you can buy lots and lots of books, because signed books are just gold. And with the holidays coming up, they make good gifts. So I'm not going to say too much about our authors. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into conversation. If you have questions for them, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you want to just chat with each other, please use the chat. I'll be kind of paying attention to it, but it usually goes by too fast for me to pick up questions. So use the Q&A for questions. So I'm going to start with Denise. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your most recent book.
Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in Iowa in the US. My debut novel came out in 2020, and so I got real used to doing these Zoom calls. So anytime I get to meet readers and talk to other authors in person or on Zoom is just really wonderful. I write contemporary romance and rom-coms, and my 10th book will be out 10th in March, and it is this one, which is about a lottery winner and a donut store and fake dating, and there's lots of sprinkle puns and sex in donut shops. So that is super fun. And then my most recent one was Technically Yours, which came out last December, which was a second chance romance set in the world of a tech nonprofit, like Girls Who Code.
Mm-hmm. So sex in a donut shop, not super safe serve, but delicious.
Yeah, I've done my Safe Serve certification, and so I felt comfortable with how I arranged it, that we wouldn't get like a super bad health code violation, but
Awesome.
That's
Okay.
romance.
Yeah, set the scene. Sierra.
Hi, I am Sierra Simone. I write spicy, provocative romance in pretty much every subgenre. I'm probably best known for my books Priest. My most recent series is a contemporary queer retelling of the Tristan Isolde legend. And I made my best friend Julie Murphy buy a house down the street from me so that we wouldn't have to be on separate Zoom calls anymore. So I could just walk to her house and be on a Zoom call in her basement.
Your dogs do bark a lot, so I feel like this is really beneficial to everyone.
I had to start doing virtual events elsewhere.
Yeah, we're not listening to the giant German Shepherds.
I have 2 German Shepherds, and they want to be on the Zoom call too.
Yeah.
They've got thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I love that you not only are neighbors, but you also write together and have these spicy books and usually holiday type books that I just think are hilariously funny and spicy. So, Julie, tell us about yourself. As I had mentioned earlier, before we started, I've been a fan since Dumplin'.
Yeah, so I'm Julie Murphy. I'm probably most well known for a little book called Dumplin' that is also a film on Netflix with a soundtrack by Dolly Parton, which is wild. And those words will never feel like, I always feel like a body snatcher when I say those words out loud. And I write books for everyone from cradle to grave. So everything from picture books all the way on up to adult romances with my dear friend, Sierra Simone. And we're about to release the last in our Christmas Notch series, and then Never Fear, because we're starting a new series next year.
I love the Christmas Notch series. It's hilarious. Olivia, your book, First Bite. Oh my God. I can't even say. Go ahead. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Olivia Dade. I am an author of adult rom-coms, but as of next August, also my first paranormal romance called Zom Rom-Com. So it is still a romantic comedy, but also includes zombies and other items. So perfect for spooky season, and I'm really excited about that. My last book that I wrote, as Mina mentioned, was At First Sight. And it is basically the story of a woman who breaks up with her fiance, only to be forced to move into a house between him and his older brother, who convinced his younger brother to leave her. And it is a romance between her and the older brother. So there's some angst and but there's a lot of humor in there. And right, all my books have at least one character, sometimes both, who are fat and wonderful and amazing and sexy and they're very nerdy. That's about what I have to say.
I love it. And that is a perfect segue into my first question is, what is the words how do you describe somebody who, Olivia, you said fat. How do you describe somebody who, because the words are so important in your books and in life. What words do you use to describe somebody who, before was plus sized or oversized or all those horrible words? Sierra?
Yeah, I think that Julie and I usually calibrate our words for our audience. So it just kind of depends on who we're talking to. I think fat is our favorite word because I think it's the most neutral description. I think it's the most important word to sort of normalize and like bring up to like a normative understanding. But I will say that there are certain like publishing contexts where I think that there are people who are just not quite as plugged into the conversation about body positivity, where we will default maybe to plus size because we don't want our messaging maybe to get like caught up in someone's brain where they're sort of having like it's the first time they've heard someone use that word neutrally. And so I think when we're talking to like publicity and marketing people, sometimes they'll be like plus size, body positivity, not straight size, where in other contexts, I think fat would probably be our go-to word.
Yeah, I think especially in our books, fat is our go-to word, but I think that the word fat can sometimes require education. So like around why it's a neutral word. And so sometimes we do default to those words that feel more, I hate to phrase it this way, but polite to some people. So,
and there are people who, like, my mom hates the word fat.
yeah.
And she understands why I'm using it, but for her, there's so much hurtful personal experience caught up in that word that, like, the leftover trauma of that is such that when it's been thrown at her as a pejorative, that it's hard for her to see it as neutral, even though that's how I'm using it. And I think that it's not a pejorative unless you make it a pejorative, but it has been for her. So she's uncomfortable with that. So she would probably say plus size, but yeah, there's nothing inherently, as you said, there's nothing, it's a neutral word. It is a descriptor, like tall or brunette or whatever. So that is my preferred word.
But I think you're right that like words like tall or short or whatever, some of those more descriptive words don't have the trauma associated with fat. Denise, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. Fat is usually the word I use if it's a broad descriptor. More often, I actually than using slim, trim, skinny, fat, whatever. I usually I'm describing the body in general, just in my writing. That's just kind of my writing style. Any of my editors or beta readers would tell you I never describe my characters enough. But I think fat for me is a word that there is so much almost like reclamation for it for so many of us who grew up with it as a pejorative term, as a hurtful term, as something to avoid, that there is so much power in being able to use that in a positive or neutral context. But oftentimes, depending on who I'm writing for, there will be that in a joke or in the context of the story, there will be some piece of that education that goes with it so that I can provide some context to it for folks who haven't reclaimed that word yet, or for folks like Olivia's, you were talking about your mom, like who that is a hurtful word, but I can still give some context around it. But then I also think about who the character is and the terminology that they might use if they're speaking. And I think sometimes that can show some character evolution or some generational pieces too.
So that was a curious thing that you just said, though, that you use slim and trim and fat. So do you describe all of your characters' body types or just the fat ones. That's been coming up recently in our books.
Oh, no, if I'm going to describe body types, and again, I don't describe my characters that much because I like to imagine them as a reader. So my editor's watching, I'm working on it. But no, if I'm going to describe someone's body, it's not just the person who is fat. It's not just the person who is muscular or whatever. Like if I'm going to describe bodies, it's describing them for the reason I need to describe them. And I think that is the case for all of us, many authors who do that. And I think it's just how we give a sense of that person. And what about their body do I need to tell you as the reader for the story to make sense? Because I also don't always have to tell you everything about somebody's body for you to know them as a character too. So it's finding that balance, I think.
So Julian's here. I see you nodding about that too. Like, how do you handle the different body types of your characters?
Yeah, I think that I think early on in my career, my primary goal was to always describe the fat characters in my book because those were the descriptors that I was always looking for as a reader. But I do think that as fatness has become less of a plot point in my books and more of like an incidental point in my books, it has become more important to me to equally describe all the characters in the books. Like Denise was saying, I am so bad at describing characters to begin with. Like they exist in my head the same way that like when I was 8 years old, I would dream of my own wedding and the person at the end of the aisle existed in my head. Like it's just like a little bit of a blur, but hot, like a hot blur.
Steam coming out from the blur.
yeah, like little heart emojis coming out from the blur. So I do like make an effort to describe like each character's bodies, but I also don't know that like it's not a huge focus of mine until there is a point when clothes are coming off in a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is luckily for us often enough.
A lot, very often. Yeah.
Clothes are totally optional in your books. I love it. Olivia, do you have a thought on that? How do you characterize your?
I mean, I would say this is that most of my side characters, I would hope that the least interesting thing about them was their body, whatever their body looks like. I do try to make sure I identify fat characters just because I think there are a large population of readers hungry to see it. And I think, unfortunately, the presumption is still the default is thin.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the history of romance and the fact that the vast majority of characters, both primary and secondary and tertiary in books has always been thin, that the assumption will be unless you say something, I think readers typically assume that they're thin. So, I mean, that's why I think it's actually more important to at some point indicate if a character is fat, if you want to offer that representation, which is very important to me. Yep, that would be the main thing that I would say. Yep. Thought I had something else, and if I did, it's gone now.
Well, if it comes back to you in the next 45 minutes, please let us know. So yeah, I should actually qualify that comment that I just made about it's coming up in our books, is it's more about race, where people now authors are saying, you know, not just this is a Black character, they're also saying, okay, this is a white character, or this is a Hispanic character, or something like that. So they're trying to, I've seen it more where they're trying to do all races, like make sure that they comment on all races, not just one. So I do want to go back to, I kind of jumped in face first here. So, or feet first, is why do you think that romance should be leading the charge on this topic of body positivity, or is it? Julie?
Yeah, I do think that at least in like recent history of books, I think that young adult was really like pushing the boundaries just a tad before romance was. But I do think romance has become so much more fat friendly, but it's still not like nearly enough. But I think that why it is so specifically important in romance is because like bodies and body language are such a huge communicator in a romance novel, that to understand that all bodies are capable of the things that occur in a romance novel and deserving of those things, from like sex to affection to just, like simply holding hands, like is extremely, extremely important. I think that, for as much as we like to say that like it's so important to love yourself before you can love anything or anyone else, I do think it's important for us to see for it to be illustrated for us what it looks like for other people to love us as well. I think it becomes easier for readers and people in general to imagine that love being bestowed upon them, and for that love to be a normal thing rather than something that feels like so unattainable and put on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm. And Denise, I interrupted you.
Well, I was going to add, I completely agree there. I think that that's a lot of power in that. And I think romance has the power to show love stories in a lot of different contexts and for a lot of different identities and what that looks like. And thinking about the power of showing what is lovable and who is lovable and how that looks is a very powerful thing. And that's why I think romance has so often been at the vanguard of inclusivity in literature. But I also wanted to comment that I don't think that bodies in romance is not new. I would say it's much newer to white romance and mainstream romance, that has been the case in Black romance and in brown romance for a very long time. And so I just wanted to put that forward, that I think this is a newer topic of conversation and a newer inroad to show the variability and diversity of human experience in mainstream romance and what we're seeing on shelves. But I also think that I just wanted to give credence that has happened for a long time in especially Black romance spaces and brown romance spaces. And that's just some different kind of cultural norms. But I think that that's an interesting piece to it too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I just listened to a really great audiobook called Butts, a backstory. And but one of the things that it explores is sort of like the size and shape of butts, right? Is dependent on your social location. And so the conversation about race as it appeals to like what makes a butt an attractive butt goes back to like the Victorian era, and like how those sort of vectors of cultural desire are shared, how cultural appropriation has like repeatedly affected how we have conversations about butts in the mainstream. But it was a really fascinating lens into how different intersections of history and like culture and cultural appropriation have impacted the way we talk about bodies, and especially body size, right? So like big butts and like who's allowed to have a big butt and in what context is like really dependent on your social location. So highly recommend Butts, a backstory for anyone who's curious about like race, bodies, and desire and how they've impacted each other.
Olivia? I don't actually remember the question, but
I mean, the only thing I need to add, because I agree with everything that was said, is that even though romance is fiction, it is a cultural artifact that sort of lays out who does a cultural think gets to be loved and like get to be desired. And so the importance of fat bodies and body diversity in romance is that for a long time, at least in a lot of traditional romance, the vast majority of people who you were told again and again and again, these people can be desired, these people can be loved, these people can have a happy ending, was very limited to, well, I mean, in a variety of ways. Thin, white, cishet, abled, all sorts of things. So I think that it's especially important when reading romance that message becomes broadened to say that like there is no one good body type. There is that you can be loved no matter what you look like. And there is no size beyond which you are no longer desirable or lovable or can't have a happy ending. So
right. I love that because people are all different sizes and all different ables and all different, and it actually comes to the question that we have in the Q&A right now is how come everyone has a flat stomach in romance books when in reality it's rarely the case? So in romance books, as we talk about body positivity, why, as Denise, you mentioned, culturally, you can have, a different body type, but as you said, white cisnet, it's just not reflective of the actual community. Why is that? Sierra?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this has to go back to sort of our templates for characters and character archetypes. I think our cultural templates are really dependent on kind of the dominant bodies that we see in TV and movies and music videos on social media. Like that is just going to form sort of a default image in our heads. And I think that artists are not immune from these kinds of cultural templates. Like, for example, I used to work at a 1950s all electric house as a tour guide. I put on a poodle skirt and showed people around this house. And in the master bedroom, there were two beds for like the husband and wife to sleep in, these two separate beds. Even though most married couples have historically and do currently sleep in a conjoined bed in one bed. But it was because on TV at the time, you saw these main characters sleeping in separate beds. And so there was an assumption by the interior designers that that was desirable, that that was like the cultural template that everyone wanted to follow. And so I think that that always stuck with me as an example of how what we see reflected around us in art can like recursively affect how we then see the world and recreate those narratives in the world. And so that's one of the reasons why I really love consuming not just books, but TV and movies that center fat bodies, is because it helps me as the artist and the creator make sure that what I am in turn putting out into the world is, disruptive and not normative.
Mm-hmm. Julie?
She's so smart and pretty. That's my answer. No, I do really agree, and I think that early on in like my discovery of fat positivity, I had to retrain my mind to learn that fat bodies were like something to be admired and something to be enamored by. And so I had to really go through and like reconfigure even my social media to start following more fat bodies, like back in the Tumblr days, to make sure I was following accounts that centered fat bodies. And I think that that really did help retrain my mind for what I found beautiful, because even then I was still having a hard time believing the thing that I was telling myself to be true.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, did you already answer this question, or do you have some more thoughts?
I mean, I would say that, I think this is an issue actually even within fat representation, is that for a long time, if you could find fat representation, a lot of it had really prioritized and prized hourglass figures. And there was a lot of description of how like she could have big breasts, big hips, even a big butt, but a small waist. And no description of having a larger stomach. And so, I mean, one of the things that I'm very interested in is body diversity within fatness. And one thing in my covers that I've always pushed for is larger waists and stomachs, because yes, some fat people have, thinner waists, but most of us, I would say, do not, because it's proportional. And so I want to make sure that that is shown on the cover. But I think that it's a little bit of respectability politics, even within fat representation sometimes, that this is the acceptable type of fat, is if like bigger breasts, big hips, small waist, that is that is more the acceptable type of fatness, which is why you see it more, and less description of like the swell of a belly, which is not inherently, I mean, you have larger hips, like it's just, there are no curves in wrong places, but there has been, culturally more an emphasis on curves in the right places, which were this more sexualized portions of the body versus the non-sexualized portions.
Wow. Denise.
I'm trying to go back to what the original question was, but I don't remember. So I'll just answer a question that's in my head. But I think the piece of retraining what we're looking for, when I was writing The Fastest Way to Fall, which is this one, and it has a fat main character, and it's really around her journey with fitness that is about strength and all of this. But there was a scene in the book that I really loved, and I sent it to a beta writer, Cass Newbold, who writes wonderful fat characters in the YA and middle grade space. And the character is a little drunk and about to go on the internet and do a fitness journey and is sort of taking stock of her own body. And here's what I love and here's what I don't like and da da da. And I sent it to Cass and she's like, but what if she just loved everything? And I remember thinking initially, like, well, you can't do that. And then I rewrote the scene and she does love everything she sees. And that was really a moment for me in thinking about, even when I feel like I've gotten to this point, there's always more to learn and think about in terms of how I look at myself. And now every time, I am drunk and in my underwear looking in the mirror, which, happens more often than not as an author, I think about that. And I do that in my writing now and just looking at, well, what if I loved everything? What if I saw this as all beautiful, and really figuring out how to challenge some of those internalized things. And I think many of us as authors, and us, the capital U royal us as a group, are figuring that out. And that's why you see, I think, especially with heroes, so many flat stomachs and traditionally very fit bodies, because I think we've seen less growth in showing men in fat positive spaces than we have maybe even in showing women and characters of other genders in fat positive spaces. So that wasn't the question you asked at all. I just went rogue, but I do think that that's something we can kind of see. But I also always challenge readers when they say, I'm only seeing cis characters, I'm only seeing white characters, I'm only seeing flat stomach characters, is to maybe think about broadening who you're reading too, because there is that representation out there. I mean, all of us write those books, but so many other people do. And so sometimes that, I think, is also as readers thinking, like, what am I demanding from authors? What am I demanding from publishers? Because money talks and money walks, and readers have so much power in that space to say, we want more of this. We want to see this. So that's, again, another rant that you didn't ask for, but it's my gift to you.
I just want to add to that, because to what Denise and to your point, Olivia, about curves in the right places, is that it is a really gendered template. And I think that is one of the most powerful things that trans and non-binary authors are bringing to the conversation is, these are authors who are unpacking sort of like what body and gender mean, just as like inherent to their stories. And so there are so many really incredible like genderqueer romances that I think that really start unpacking like who is allowed to have a body that is big in certain ways, right? And so I find that like to be really valuable too, like when we're talking about curves in the right places, right? Like that is a hyper feminine expectation. And so having a larger stomach is challenging gender. And that sometimes can add an additional vector of discomfort, I think, for readers, because it's like they need that reassurance, right? That we're not going to be like troubling the boundaries of gender too much. And so when you start kind of lifting up the corners of gender, I think you start finding sort of a discomfort that is worth artistically kind of diving into.
And another thing that I want to add, sort of when we're talking about challenging within fat representation, a few sort of areas that I think there needs to be more push on. One of them is men and other non-femme fat characters, but also I think for a long time there's been a real emphasis that there is a good type of fat, which is that you're healthy. Like the whole idea that like I don't really remember, maybe there are, I'm sure they exist, but there aren't a ton of fat characters who might have diabetes, who might have, there's the idea that being fat is okay as long as like you're quote unquote healthy. And I think that there's a lot of room for growth in looking at the fact that you can still be sexy and loved. And even if you're fat and even if you have health issues. And so, Yeah, that's another area where I think they're pushing against some areas of real discomfort, similar to what you all were talking about. And I think that that's an area where there's work to be done, and I should be doing more of it. So that's a reminder to myself.
Yeah, that's so, so true, Olivia.
It's probably not the best time to make a joke, but I was gonna say that to what you said, Sierra, is that I think men have always been only allowed to be large in one place in romance.
Yeah, so true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, but we do have a question from the audience, from Dina saying, what about the men? Because I know, Olivia, you have a book where you have a Crunchyroll male character who's got a little belly there. But what about the fantasy? Like that's what people talk about is like the guy has to be a certain look in order to be.
But that's the same thing. Like you could say, well, the men have a certain fantasy, but I think that that's looking at all people who are attracted to a certain type of person as a monolith.
Mhm.
There are a lot of big guys I think are super hot. Like it's not a monolith that only certain types of men are attractive. And I think probably a bunch of us have been in relationships or marriages with men who are not super thin or super ripped and find them sexy.
Mhm.
So like, why shouldn't that be represented on the page? My next book for Avon will have a fat male main character too. And yeah, Peter in Shipwreck does not just have a little belly, he is fat. And yeah, I do think it's important. I think my guess is that when I first started writing fat female main characters, I was reacting to a lot of what I saw in movies and television, in which case you had fat male characters who always got like very thin, conventionally beautiful wives and girlfriends. And so I was sort of reacting to that and sort of flipping that while sort of not paying attention to the fact that within romance, that's not how it had worked. When I had seen when I was younger, I'm 47. I was reading romance since I was way too young, 7 or 8. So like when I was younger and seeing the very few representations of fatness that I came across at that time, but those were all thinner men. And so I did not put that together till I talked with, I don't know if you remember Corey Alexander, Zan West. I was talking with them about this because I sort of was positing that I think that sometimes there's the assumption that the only person who could love or desire a fat person is another fat person. And I was trying to work against that. But as Zan pointed out, as Corey pointed out, they said, you don't need somehow the stamp of approval of a thin person to say that you're attractive or lovable or desirable as a fat person. And that when you keep pairing fat people with thin people, that can be sort of the presumption is that you need their approval to sort of prove that you are acceptable. And that when you pair two fat people together, there is a power to that, or more than two, as the case may be. There is power to that because you're saying you don't need the stamp of approval from someone who's considered conventionally attractive. So
yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding going on, so please feel not nodding as in the sexual way, but like nodding in heads.
We can talk about that too.
Yeah.
What's happening in the background?
We're in a real fan fiction place right now, so lots of fan fiction. Yeah, I think that like Olivia was saying, like my first few like romantic pairings in my books when I first started writing about fat characters were definitely in response to that. But I do think that it is equally as important. I think it's equally important to show like mixed sized like pairings as it is to show two fat characters, because I remember even growing up, like my friends, when they would try to set me up with someone, they would always try to set me up with like the biggest guy in the group, and just like this automatic assumption that like, oh well, you're both large people, and so only large people could be attracted to other large people. So it was especially like with Dumplin', it was really like a rebellion against that notion. And it actually, like, on the other side of that coin, though, it took me a while to choose to date fat people, because I, for so long, had thought that this, this is what people only think I'm deserving of. And it took me a long time to retrain my brain to learn that like fat people are attractive, fat people can be deeply sexy. So I do think that both of those notions are equally important. And like as someone who is in like a marriage with someone whose like size has fluctuated over the last 15 whatever years, it is very like wild to see how people treat you when your spouse is perceived as smaller than you or thinner than you. It was very jarring to me because when I first met my spouse, they were not a smaller person, and like I said, their sizes fluctuated. So I think that there's a lot of value in both of those different pairings.
Denise?
I was going to add all of that. I think I agree on. And then the other piece, I think, especially with how men and masculine characters are depicted in romance, thinking about how we show size and larger sizes and fat bodies, but how do we show short bodies or very thin bodies, especially on in masculine characters. I think there really has been a prototype that, again, we've diverted from less. And so I'm blanking on all of their names, of course, because I've never read a book in my life, but some great authors in indie spaces who are really like heralding the short king and who are showing fat, beautiful heroines with matches who have unexpected body types, whether fat, thin, short, different pieces. And I think that is another dimension of that as well. And speaks to kind of Julie's point of, does this love and sexiness have to be somebody who is taller than us or broader than us or able to envelop us or something like that? And the answer is no, but we don't always see that. So I think that's just another piece of it.
Sierra, did you have a thought on this?
I mean, I would just add that I think that this is not something that even queer romance is immune to, templating masculine characters in such a way. And so I think that a lot of really interesting work has been done in trans and non-binary romance, in kind of structuring how masculine characters or mask-leaning characters are presented. Because I do think that one of the things about writing inclusively is you don't want to create a template where masculinity equals being 6'4" and you can cross a room in 2 strides, when you want to. Like, I think that there are men, there are masked people who are never going to be able to cross a room in 2 strides. And so I think that like there are some really interesting books that do it. I'm glad that you mentioned Zan West and Corey. They are no longer with us, but I do believe you can still find their books. And they have a lot of really incredible books exploring a huge diversity of bodies.
I have a question here about disability, which I'm going to try to stay on topic, but it's a curious question about like not really seeing characters with disabilities. And the question is about keeping true to the person's disability while writing their character. And I want to ask that in terms of the body positivity. How do you create realistic, true to fat people characters that we can resonate with as readers? Denise, I'm going to start with you on that.
I don't know if this answers the question. I haven't written a lot of my characters with disabilities at this point anyway. But I do think when we're building a character, it's building a person. And so I think if you're building a character as a true person who's a 3-dimensional person, you're thinking through what is their body type? What is their body? What social location are they in? How is that treated? What things shape their upbringing? What's their job? Who are they just as a personality? Like, you're building out all of that. And I think in representing someone truly, you're thinking about them as a 3-dimensional person and not just a fat body, a black body, a woman body. You're building a true character, then you're building a person. And so I think that goes into your research, into if we're talking about disability, if we're talking about body size, if we're talking about health condition, if we're talking about race, whatever that is, it's research. It's making sure we have the depth and position, social positioning to write that character. But in all things, it's making sure that we are writing a three-dimensional person. And so looking at how different aspects may come into the story or not, how may shape how a person treats other people or is treated, how they move through the world, is sometimes just going to show up in a variety of ways. And I fly a lot for work. And so I think about like being on a plane as a fat person, as a Black person, as a woman, the things that I take into account when I am traveling that others I'm traveling may not. Like being comfortable asking for a seatbelt extender as soon as I get on the plane and like getting rid of the shame of that. I love those seatbelt extenders. I wish I could just bring my own. But that, or when I'm dropping off my rental car, or the way I move through an airport, knowing who's there and where I am in the country, like all of those pieces may have nothing to do with the romance story that I'm writing and the hot sex I'm about to have, like on the flight line with the baggage handler in the book, not in real life. I'm married.
I was like, man, all right.
All of right. What is my job? All those details. All those details are going to shape the three-dimensionality of my character in that book. And so I think in that way, that's how authors can be really intentional about showing all things realistically.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard this, but I really think that's a next level of research for you, Denise, for the baggage handler. Thank you.
My husband is down the hall. I may not share with him. Nor my boss.
That would be a spicy role play idea, right?
Yeah.
I already wrote the airport novella, so maybe that is airport novellas. Maybe that's the fourth one.
Funny. How about you, Olivia? How do you make your characters true to whatever they're experiencing?
I mean, I think that it's basically just like, it's just like writing a thing character, except that their body's bigger. And like Denise was saying, you do have to sort of look at how having a larger body changes how you move through the world. And it is true that different people have different relationships to their bodies and to their fatness. Some will have more insecurities than others. Some will be more confident. But I think that if you are someone who writes characters as far more than like their appearance, then all those things that Denise listed are going to come into play. Your background, your job, all those things. And I would say about disability, I have written neurodiversity in some of my books, like if you consider depression, neurodiversity, that's in there, and ADHD and dyslexia, also chronic joint pain for one of my and again, all of those things, when I include them, I look at how would that actually impact the daily life that might be mentioned in the book. And it's important in their lives, but it is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the love story, and you can look at how that fact about their body sort of impacts their life without necessarily always making it sort of the crux of the story one way or another. But yes, disability representation is something that is also very important, and hopefully there's more of that. A good person who often tackles both Talia Hibbert. I try to spread the good word of Talia Hibbert wherever I can. The Brown Sisters trilogy is fantastic. And someone actually asked, who do you send people to for fat characters? I think is one of the questions. I send them to Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and tell them to read the Brown Sisters trilogy is where I send people. And then Rebecca Weatherspoon off it too.
I was also
and Denise mentioned Rebecca Weatherspoon.
Oh yeah, we're big Rebecca fans for sure.
I was also going to mention Talia Hibbert. She's just one of my favorites. And I was also going to say, in response to something you said, Olivia, that one of my favorite books with fat characters was Good Luck With That by Kristen Higgins, because it made me understand that it's not always how people view you. It's how you think people will view you because you're fat or you're different from them. And I just love that whole concept that we expect to be treated a certain way because of our own impression of ourselves. Sierra and Julie, do you want to duke out who's going to talk about this? Because you write characters together. So does that enhance your writing, or does that make it more difficult because now you have to bring two perspectives together?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're getting kind of granular about disability, so in our last book, A Holly Jolly Ever After, the heroine has narcolepsy. I have narcolepsy. Narcolepsy and bodies are very intertwined in the sense that, well, it can take a long time to get diagnosed with narcolepsy, and there is a presumption of laziness on top of narcolepsy. There is a presumption of sloth. And so if you have a larger body, those two things are usually linked in a doctor's mind. Your body would change if you would just sleep less. Your body would change if you would just get out more. And then, once you are diagnosed, you would think kind of like a switch would be flipped, right? Where people would be like, oh, like actually your brain is just bad at regulating sleep. But I haven't found that always to be the case. And I think it's also, narcolepsy is a very misunderstood disorder. And so it's also like something that I have to repeatedly sort of reintroduce to new people as they come into my life, this concept of needing more sleep, and how that is not actually like a reflection of my inner drive or my hopes and visions as an adult who gets things done in the world. And so I kind of did the deep research for a narcoleptic character by being narcoleptic. And so Julie and I were able to sort of be in conversation about how narcolepsy would realistically affect this character. But there's a saying in the narcolepsy community that I have narcolepsy doesn't have me. And it's sort of this idea that, we're still going to live full, robust lives despite this disorder. And so, I think Denise and Olivia both made the like really insightful point that in order to write a three-dimensional character, when you're layering in factors like disability and bodies, that's sort of not going to be the only bullet points about that character. And so for us, I think it's always about making sure that character has a very, very robust data set of information about them, so readers walk away feeling like they really got to know this person.
Yeah. And I do think that, like, coming from marginalized communities, there is a point at which we have to look to marginalized authors to write those stories. We have to create the space for those people. But I do think, and this is a thing that I don't even know how to say out loud, so you might have to fix my words for me, Sierra Simone. But I do think there's a tipping point at which we can't just rely on marginalized authors to do these things. So whether it's populating your world with disabled characters, like characters of varying skin color, things like that, whatever it is, like that falls on all of us, as far as like creating diverse worlds. But I do think that, like, in the last year especially, I have started to think about like bodies and health in a different way. I had a big cancer scare this year.
It wasn't a scare, you had cancer.
Okay, I had cancer and had like a radical hysterectomy. And I have been thinking a lot about I haven't read a lot of romance books with like hysterectomies and what that looks like and how you feel about your body being desired after something like that. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of space to grow there. And I think that it's a thing that we all have to carry and all have to be mindful of. Also, Denise is dropping fire recommendations.
I know, I want to hop in there, but Julie has the loudest
No,
keyboard.
it's not that loud. It's a Halloween
And
keyboard.
if I started typing on it, it would sound like, I don't know.
It's not that loud.
I am muting
Like
every
the red
time I
berry.
type because my keyboard is super loud too.
Look here, I'll mute and then you can.
I think they're muted.
I did see someone just recommend TJ Alexander, and I just read his Second Chances in Newport Stephen earlier this year. Love that book. And that is a shorter queer character as well. Massive.
I was on a panel with TJ at StimulatCon and had to share that I met their grandma randomly at a Barnes and Noble in Colorado, I think. And they just said, well, my grandchild writes romance and I'm so proud of them. And then told me all about TJ's books. I was like, oh, I follow TJ on social media. And then just had this lovely conversation. So if TJ's grandma happens to be on, you're delightful and made that Colorado amazing.
Go TJ's grandma.
Oh my gosh. So it seems like, Denise, you're on this last question that we have in the Q&A for your favorite fat character written by another author. Anybody want?
So
Oh, okay.
shorter mass characters. Okay, wait, sorry. I just have to say this. The first shorter mass character I ever read was Anna and the French Kiss. It's a young adult book. And it was so sweet and delightful. And he was such a short king. Okay, I'm sorry. My ADHD brain was like, if you don't say these words right now, you're never going to remember them again. Okay, I'm sorry. Denise.
Actually, my very favorite fat character is written by our own Olivia Dade from Teach Me. And now, again, blanking on the character's actual name. But the heroine is so grumpy and a teacher and so full of love. And I stayed up all night at maybe RWA when I had to be up early the next morning finishing that book. And so that is actually one of my just very favorite characters because it was also, I think, the first time I fell in love with a character where I saw the parts of myself that I thought were less socially desirable, like the being more acerbic or being very like action oriented and achieving and specific about what I wanted and things like that. And the hero, its name is Martin. I remember that. And there's a dunking booth and they teach AP history. They care about the kids so much, and my educator heart was just warmed. And so that is actually probably my very favorite fat character, and one that I definitely wasn't the first I had read, but I recommend that book all the time. I taught a class on romance novels and social justice, and we talked about body representation in that. And so we used that as one of our core books that we bought for the students to read and like explore body diversity. So yeah, our own Olivia Dade's book. My physical copy is over here somewhere.
You just made my month. That was, that was self-pubbed and very close to my heart. He is not particularly, he's like thin and he's not overly tall. She's taller than him when she wears heels. And yeah, and she's powerful. Like she's confident and powerful, and that makes me very, very happy. Thank you.
It's such a great book.
So I'm going to ask you all to put your recommendations in the chat because I'll send out a list to everybody who's here afterwards. So Teach Me by Olivia Dade. Olivia, what's your favorite book about with a fat character by a different author? Somebody not on this panel.
I think I just mentioned it, even though she's not on this panel, but Get a Life, Chloe Brown. That's probably, I send people to that all the time, just in part because she's obviously it's Talia Hibbert, so she's way better than I could dream of being. But like a lot of people who, if they say they like my books, then typically they will adore her and probably drop me. But it's okay because then they get Talia Hibbert. So I send them her way quite a bit.
So Chloe Brown also has, I think, fibromyalgia. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a lot going on in that book, which is just so well written, and I love that book as well. Julie, Sierra, who's your favorite fat character?
You want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Well, they just said I can't say someone on this panel, and one of your books is one of my favorites.
Well, I broke the rule.
That's okay. That's true. Denise broke that rule too.
I'm only saying it because I dedicated the book to her.
Okay, but you did write okay, so I have other books to recommend, but Sierra wrote a book called Misadventures of a Curvy Girl, and she was like, I'm gonna write this book, and I was like, okay, but if you write this fat girl book, she has to be in a man sandwich between Channing Tatum and Adam Driver, and you have to write it for me.
And I did. Yeah, it is indeed Channing Tatum and Adam Driver.
Yeah. Yeah. So I am a big fan of Misadventures of a Curvy Girl. But just to give YA authors some love, I'm a huge fan of Crystal Maldonado. Of course, because I know no words right now. I can't remember the names of her two titles that I'm trying to remember right now, but those are both fantastic. There's a British author named Bethany Rutter who wrote, I think it's called No Big Deal, which is also another delightful one, and that's sort of more of like a YA new adult crossover. Yeah, that is the correct print or spelling of Bethany Rutter. Yeah, who else am I missing?
I don't know. I don't read YA. There's not enough kissing in that for me. I will have to say one of my favorites is After Hours on Milagro Street by Angelina C. Lopez. I think that Angelina is just one of the best romance writers writing today. The book is set in Kansas, which that never happens. But it is this like gorgeous fusion of horniness, history, and like this little whiff of magic that kind of threads through. Her family owns a haunted bar, and she moves back from Chicago. She's like a really famous like bartender who comes up with these amazing craft cocktail recipes, and she moves back to the haunted family bar to take it over and meets a professor with giant hands, which I think we're all looking for a little bit in our lives. And
Yeah.
it's just a gorgeous book. Everything that Angelina does is perfect. So I'm like, start there, but then like read everything that she's done.
Doesn't Nisha Sharma have some plus size characters in her?
Yes, I want to
Nisha
say
does in Tastes Like Shakar and not Dating Dr. Bill, but the other one that just came out.
Marriage and Musty. Yes.
So yeah, she has a lot of great body diversity. And then Angelina M. Lopez, I think, is just great at challenging archetypes left and right. Like she writes amazing alpha heroines. The last Malago Street definitely has that. And then her Lush Money series has that too. Like really alpha, almost toxic alpha heroines, which is a great like script flip from some other books.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me in the Q&A if I have any favorite fat characters, and I was going to mention again Dumplin, because it was my first foray into a fat character, and how lovely she was, and how like she had all of the insecurities, but she still went forward, and I just love that. So I'm going to break the rule as well, Denise, and say Dumplin by Julie Murphy. Although I did love it. Oh my God, I'm going to totally, at first spite. Oh my God, such a good book. Such a good book. All right, so we just have a couple more minutes. I just want to ask really quickly if you think that publishing is embracing or a barrier to getting more books in the hands of readers around body positivity in romance. I'm going to start with you, Denise.
Publishing, is it opening doors or closing them? I think there's certainly a push for publishing to, as a business, make money and get readers what they are saying that they want and what they are paying money for and what they're willing to buy for. I think that is definitely more accessible when we're looking at white authors and white characters. I think when you look at traditional publishing, so not the indie spaces, but traditionally published books, you are much more likely to find fat characters who are white. You are much more likely to find queer characters who are white. Characters with disabilities, neurodivergent characters who are white. So I think that there are still gates along the way of what is sort of seen as readers wanting and what will ultimately be a good business decision in addition to putting good books out. So I think there's that. But I think in general, the wave of romance publishing is more inclusion, is more diversity, is more like wider arms around who is getting love stories, which is ultimately a wonderful thing. But I think there are definitely still some barriers, and where a lot of folks in indie spaces are doing a lot of heavy lifting still in terms of some of that representation. So I guess my plug there is then if you don't see it in traditional spaces, like go to the indie spaces, the books are out there. Like, I mean, honestly, if you want it, someone is probably writing it or has written it, and with or without blue aliens. Like, you've got a lot of options. So just kind of ask for it if you want it, because it probably is out there. But sometimes it's in the indie spaces. You may not be finding it at Target, or you may need to request it from your library or some of those pieces.
I am going to say I'm a huge fan of the blue aliens. So those indie spaces are wonderful for all kinds of diversity, I'm going to say. How about you, Sierra? What do you think about this?
Yeah, sorry, I got stuck on aliens. Actually, if anyone likes aliens, but they want a little bit more inclusivity, Taylor Vaughn has a series of alien romances. They are very, it's a combination of Theodora Taylor and Eve Vaughn. They write together. They are a little like, I would maybe check out like reviews or content warnings to make sure it's for you. They are a little intense, but oh my gosh,
I love Kimberly Lemming.
Oh my gosh. Oh, and Kimberly Lemming too. Yeah, those like cozy romantic-y spaces. So yeah, I would say that kind of what Denise was saying, it's sort of hard to contextualize what doors are open and what doors are closed because they're shifting, and there is definitely a question of intersectionality there. So, as soon as you sort of present something like a fat character, like I do feel like there is more then you might find more barriers as you add intersectionality to that. And so I do feel like there is a good energy behind bringing inclusivity to romance. I do think that when you are dealing with capitalism and you are looking at the big 5 publishers, and one of the publishers is owned by like the Murdoch family and the other one is owned by some French billionaire, I can't remember, like you are dealing with the most explicit forces of capitalism in the world. And so I think that that's always going to be a pressure. But I will say I feel very blessed to be working with Julie Murphy, because no one at HarperCollins will ever tell Julie Murphy that she hasn't got the right end of the stick when it comes to fat characters, how to market fat characters, how to have fat characters on covers. And so I think we've been really blessed in our experience, because they've been, any critique that we've come to them with in terms of marketing or messaging, they've been receptive to.
Yeah, I'm also a little bit of a bully, so
she's the alpha heroine.
I am the alpha heroine. Anytime we have to ask for anything, it's Sierra's like, we don't have to. We could just not ask. And I'm like already typing the email. I'm like, no, we're asking. We're doing this. But yeah, I think that I love the way Olivia talks about the right kind of fatness. And I do think that the door will always be open for the type of fatness that we are generally comfortable with, whether it's white, whether it's an hourglass or something like that. But especially like sizes like 28 and up, that's really hard for publishers to conceptualize on the cover of a book. And they still use like the body positive buzzwords to market a book, but once you start to integrate things that like people might not be widely comfortable with about fat bodies, it becomes more difficult. So yeah, I mean, I think that as long as like quote unquote body positivity is in like the public like zeitgeist, and as long as that is like a popularized phrase, it will be possible and acceptable to publish books about fat characters. But I mean, this is always going to be like rising and falling waves of pop culture, and there is coming a time, and there is slightly a time right now when being fat is like not as acceptable as it was even 2 or 3 years ago. So I we'll see what happens with publishing.
Mm-hmm. And Olivia.
I think for me, there's a little bit of a split between my personal experience in publishing, but again, as a white cishet lady, is that my publishers, my traditional publishers, have been very supportive from the beginning. It was clear. Spoiler alert, was my first wide trad pub traditionally published book, and from the beginning, it was clear that fatness was going to be that for that book. Fatness was part of the story because I had some things I wanted to say about family dynamics around fatness, and also fat shaming in online spaces and in communities. And my publishers, and including a fat male main character too, I've received no pushback for any of my depictions of fatness within my books to this point. So I have had a very good experience with that. That said, I think one thing that needs to be looked at is there's a difference between books being acquired, particularly intersectional books, like where you have fat, non-white main characters, and you look at acquisition, but you also look at how they're supported by publishers. Like what happens after, like before publication, after publication, how much money is going into them being marketed, and do publishers know how to, or are they willing to market those books? So I think that there's a disconnect there sometimes. I also am a little concerned about, I think that it has gotten easier in recent years with book talk for publishers to look at independently published books that have been successful and cherry pick them to trad pub them. but almost all the books who have been successful on Book Talk are white. And so I think that it's, I think that sometimes what has become most popular in Book Talk may not be the most diverse, like in any sense, the most diverse books that are out there. And so my concern is that if that becomes sort of a business model, because I'm not clear that I think publishers have been very good about selling to bookstores and to retail stores, but maybe not as good about actually selling to individual people. But indie authors are very good at that. And so I think I think they are smart in a lot of ways to sort of see people who are already reaching individual readers and picking them out. But unfortunately, some of those people who have become big names, a lot of them are not super diverse in any sense. And then my concern is that if the business model sort of goes toward that, as you're saying, like there might be a drop off in books getting acquired, but then also marketed successfully.
Which I think is a wraparound. I travel all around the country a lot for work. I always go into bookshops. I go into a lot of Barnes and Nobles, and you can see no greater illustration of Olivia's point than the front tables at most Barnes and Nobles, which is where libraries have so much power and getting recommendations from librarians. And I think that as we're here, with the Ashland Library and with all the other partner libraries who are joining us, like that's where there is so much power in libraries and in librarians and spreading all of these great romance books that we're talking about that, again, you may not see at the front table right in front of you when you walk into these different bookshops. And so just to remind everybody to use your libraries, to visit them often and support them as you can, and for all of us to be doing that.
You were the best segue person ever, Denise.
Yeah. What talent,
Yes, because I'm gonna probably cry after this because that is so true. Like libraries have been having problems because they offer diversity to communities, right? Like that's what we're trying to do, and yet we're getting a lot of pushback. So I appreciate that because that is our goal, is to bring out the books that people should, like they don't see themselves. And so we're a little bit over time. I so appreciate all of your time, thought, wisdom, humor, and everything that helps us be better people and better readers. We are all fans of yours. People have been like putting up the emojis. I love it. So thank you all for being here. And I really appreciate everybody who came and listened and had such great questions. And I will send out that list afterwards with the recording video, and make sure you either buy their books or get them from the library because they're fantastic. Thank you all, Denise, Julie, Sierra, Olivia. An amazing pleasure and such an honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Have a good
Bye.
one.
Yeah, bye, everybody.
Bye.